Reading this morning be from Jeremiah 17, verses 7 and 8. Jeremiah 17, verses 7 and 8. Blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord, and whose trust is in the Lord, for he will be like a tree planted by the water that extends its roots by a stream, and will not fear for the heat when the heat comes, but its leaves will be green, and it shall not be anxious, or will not be anxious in the year of the drought, nor cease to yield fruit. Jeremiah 17, 7 and 8.
You probably heard an old story called Pandora and the Box. It's a pretty ancient story, and there's actually different versions of it. I didn't know it until I kind of looked up a couple of things. There's more than one version, and it's kind of changed over the years. But in case you don't happen to know the gist of it, it's basically there's this girl, and her name's Pandora, and she's told not to open a box, and she's too curious, and she eventually gets around to opening it, and all kinds of terrible things come out, like disease and war and lies, betrayal, hatred, doubt, all those things. And they come out in the form of these strange-looking creatures. And as they come out, they sting and they bite her as they escape. And of course, realizing she's made a huge mistake, she tries to slam the lid back down and to close it again. But everything gets out. And the story goes that everything gets out except for one creature. And I didn't know this until I looked it up. I thought they all escaped, but according to the story, there's one creature that doesn't get out, and it's hope. At this point, there's two drastically different versions and variations of those two, but essentially, one version is that hope was put in the box as one of the last creatures in there, so that when it got out, it could help us deal with the rest. And in fact, one story has Pandora coming back and intentionally releasing hope. The other version kind of surprised me. The argument was in this story is that hope was the worst of the creatures. It was a weak, wretched, frail thing, the worst of all the evils in the box, because it convinced people that evil could be beaten, and it provided them with blind optimism, that they would trust in hope that didn't really exist. And that's one of the worst things you can do to a person, probably, is send them off to fight something when you know they're going to lose, or to tell someone they have a chance when they don't. And so there's that idea, and that kind of surprised me. And of course, Pandora is a mythological story, but makes you wonder which version is closer to the truth. It's an important question. Is hope a good thing or a bad thing? And I mean, you might be quick to say this morning, well, hope is good. It's always good. It's always good to have hope. But not everyone thinks so. Even those who would say hope is good, I think deep down, some of them are convinced that hope is a weak, wretched, frail thing. The experts say they would probably tell you that hope is believing in a positive outcome, even though the situation looks bad. And that sounds reasonable. But there's something here to notice. Optimism is based on rational thought. Hope seems to be based purely on emotion, and that's an important difference to see. Hope is thought to not be about rational thought, that it's just pure emotion. I really, really hope that this is the case. Not everyone thinks this way, but deep down, I think for a lot of people, hope seems to be a weak thing, a frail word we use in desperate situations. When everything else has been used up, it's time for hope. No other options left, our back is against the wall, and we pull out hope. If the situation is doomed to fail, we call it false hope. But even real hope seems kind of pitiful, something we use if we're forced to. It's kind of like if there's a football game, all the good players are injured. You turn to the scrawny guy on the bench, not just second string, but third string, and we send him in, but only because we're desperate. That's what some people think hope is. What we're really talking about is the world's idea of hope. It's a very breakable thing made of ignorance. It's just another form of wishful thinking. The Bible has the truth of the matter, as always, and gives a much more accurate version of hope. Maybe we can learn more about real hope. And what we're going to do this morning is look at a couple of people who had no hope. They were hopeless people. And maybe we can learn more about that by looking at them. It's kind of like finding out the shape of something by looking close at the hole it leaves behind, kind of like a footprint. So we're going to go to Genesis 37, and we're going to talk about Jacob. I don't know if you ever noticed this about Jacob. For the most part, he would not be fun to be around, and I think I understand why. The account is of Jacob and his sons. There's a lot of dysfunction in this family. There's tension between the brothers. Obviously, Joseph ends up being sold into slavery by his own brothers. The plan A was to kill him. Plan B was to sell him off into slavery, and they do that. The brothers falsify evidence to make it look like Joseph was killed by an animal, and their father Jacob is convinced. Now, I don't want to make it sound like he shouldn't have felt this way, I guess, but there's no denying that in the eyes of Jacob, there's been a terrible tragedy. If you look at Genesis 37:25, you'll notice he's so devastated. Notice this phrase that says he refused to be comforted. Apparently somebody tried to comfort him, and he rejected that. He says, I'm not interested in comfort. He refused it. He refused to be comforted. And it's understandable since he has apparently lost a loved one. He might become like this, but this mindset begins to define him. It becomes who he is. And when more bad stuff happens later, he refuses to be comforted on a regular basis. Later, his family runs out of food. You probably remember there was a famine, and Jacob sends 10 of his sons to go get grain from Egypt. And Joseph, who happens to be in charge of the food, asks for Benjamin. He says, okay, I'm sending you out of here, but I want the youngest son to return, and he keeps Simeon kind of as collateral. And back home, the sons report to Jacob, and Jacob refuses to send Benjamin, and I guess Simeon's stuck. I always wondered about that they get home and say, Simeon's stuck there, and they want Benjamin, and Jacob says no, and apparently Simeon just has to sit tight. Well, the family runs out of food again, and Jacob's forced to deal with the situation. They're out of food, and this is when we see Jacob as a man who has no hope. Look at Genesis 42, verse 36. And listen carefully to what Jacob says. Genesis 42, verse 36. So they're up against the wall. They have to go get food, and so they're going to have to face this arrangement involving Benjamin. Jacob says this, and their father Jacob said to them, you have bereaved me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and you would take Benjamin. All these things are against me. Now, again, I understand that Jacob would be upset, but his perspective is messed up. If he looks at the circumstance and has no hope, everything indicates things will not turn out well. But notice something important about the things that he said. Most of it's not true. Joseph is not dead. Simeon is not dead. He even knows that. All they know is that he's been detained. But he just jumps to the conclusion Simeon's dead. Now, I understand why he thought these things, but still, his hopelessness is based on bad information. And that's what I'd like to suggest this morning about him. His hopelessness is based on incorrect information. Things are going to turn out really well. Things are going to turn out just fine, but Jacob thinks he has a realistic view of life, but he's way off. And his conclusion is, everything is against me. And that's an easy mindset to fall into for any of us. Let's go to Ruth chapter 1. Look at somebody else who's kind of similar to Jacob, probably even worse. You might argue that. We're going to talk about Naomi. She had a similar view of life. She had also had a tough time. No denying that at all. Not easy. Her husband had died. Her 2 sons had died. All that's left are her 2 daughters-in-law who have no reason to stay with her. She's got nothing. Future looks pretty bleak. Naomi, in fact, suggests a clean break and advises both of these girls to leave her. And so Naomi's plan is to head back to Bethlehem alone. That's what she's imagining the future, is returning to her hometown, walking in by herself, back to the beginning. In Ruth 1, verse 13, this is what she says. She's talking to her sisters-in-law. Says, it is harder for me than for you. for the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me. It's obvious she's a person who has no hope. Remember, Jacob said, all these things are against me. Naomi actually says, the Lord has gone forth against me. Jacob almost seems to think it was a matter of bad luck. Things are just not playing out the way they should. It's all against me. Naomi's hopelessness seems worse. Her lack of hope is not due to chance, apparently. She's convinced God is working against her, which is a whole different way of thinking. Well, Ruth promptly messes up Naomi's plans for despair and stays with her and helps her. Nothing worse than trying to be depressed when someone starts making things better. But Naomi's determined. She also refuses to be comforted. She's determined to hang on to hopelessness. Well, she gets back to her hometown in Bethlehem, and you can see this mindset in her because of what happens when she's greeted. She hears someone say her name. Look at Ruth 1, verse 20. This is how low Naomi has gotten. Ruth 1, verse 20. She said to them, do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has witnessed against me and the Almighty has afflicted me? So Naomi's not messing around. She gets back home and she announces that she is changing her name. She's done. Life stinks and there's no hope. Life is bleak and it's just going to get bleaker. She is confident that the future is grim. One of my favorite things about the book of Ruth is the number of times the word Mara shows up. Once. In fact, in the whole Bible, the number of times the word Mara shows up, once. And Naomi's the one who says it. Naomi says, call me Mara. And everyone in Bethlehem apparently probably got the memo. But no one calls her Mara. Notice that the rest of the book. Maybe they ignored it, but you know what's more important than that? God ignored it. Not once does he call her that. He says, no, we're not going to call you that. No matter how much she's counting on it, that name is not going to work. Her life is not going to be bitter. Like Jacob, her information is not correct. Her idea of what the future is going to be like is way off. Some of her information is accurate. Her husband did die. She lost her sons. But God is not against her. In fact, he's very busy working on something for her. Her perspective is messed up because her information is not complete. There are events on the way that will change everything. Strangely enough, she ends up being a matchmaker. She helps set up Ruth with a great guy named Boaz, and they get married and have a boy, a baby boy. And one day, Naomi puts that little baby on her lap. Ruth 4, verse 16 describes it this way. Ruth chapter 4, verse 16. Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her lap and became his nurse. The neighbor women gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. So they named him Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. Notice that they called her Naomi. They did not call her Mara. Things that turned out pretty well for her. After all, turns out Naomi's one of the greatest matchmakers in history. I don't know if you ever thought of it that way. That baby shows up because Naomi set up Boaz and Ruth. That baby is King David's grandfather. That baby will have many descendants. One of them is Jesus. On the way to Bethlehem, when she was returning home, Naomi was thinking, it's over. There's nothing left for me to do except feel sorry for myself and wait out the days. God was thinking, no, actually, you're going to be playing a key role in setting up the greatest earthly king and eventually the King of Kings. Other than that, yeah, you're all done. I think it's helpful to look at these people, the way that they looked at life, to show us what hopelessness looks like, and it might help us to understand what hope is. We tend to be like them. We kind of tend to veer that way. When life is not going like we want, we focus on right here and right now. But like Jacob, we often have bad information. And like Naomi, we often have incomplete information. Hopelessness, I guess you could say, is short-sighted. Going back to the football analogy, If you were in charge and the players went out there and played one play and it went badly, and they came back in and said, it's time to give up, we're done. You'd have to explain. You say, no, there's other plays to be made. It's not over. What if after the first half the players came in and said, okay, we're done? You'd have to say, no, it's not over yet. You misunderstand. I would even say, and this is where the analogy kind of falls, but even if it was the last play of the game and it was 35-0 and you're losing, in our case, we could still say, no, don't give up. We've got this. The coach has this play. It gives you 36 points. It's amazing. And if you follow that plan, you will win. You get the idea. Sometimes it's kind of like we pick up, like today. Today you're going to experience today. And it's like a small piece of a puzzle. And sometimes we pick up that piece and we look at that piece of our life and we look at that one piece of the puzzle and think, I know the big picture. I know what this puzzle turns out to be like. And we think we hold that little piece and we think, this is my life. And we're wrong. Because God is still handling things, even when it looks like He's not, especially when it looks like He's not. When it comes to hope, it's easy to get stuck on the world's version, a purely emotional wish, maybe some blind optimism, not based on rational thinking, but real hope is different. Real hope isn't based on the odds or circumstances. It's based on one simple fact. God really does exist. And if you reject Him and keep Him at a distance, life will gradually fall apart. It's just inevitable, and hope will fade. But if you stick close to Him, even when things do fall apart, He's only clearing the stage for new blessings. And the trick is remembering that most of the time, you'll be relying on bad information or incomplete information. You have to wait. That phrase is repeated often in the Bible. Wait on the Lord. You have to trust Him. But we tend to trust in everything but God. This is when we make things worse. Here's Jeremiah 17, verse 5. Jeremiah 17, verse 5. Here's what happens when we kind of try to build our own hope, I guess, and venture out on our own. And we trust in our own ideas and plans. Jeremiah 17, verse 5. Thus says the Lord, cursed is the man who trusts in mankind and makes flesh his strength, and whose heart turns away from the Lord. For he will be like a bush in the desert, and will not see when prosperity comes, but will live in stony wastes in the wilderness, a land of salt without inhabitant. When our trust is directed to worldly things away from God, that hope does lead us to a wasteland. But a Christian learns to trust God. We measure things by God, not by circumstances. We trust in God regardless of our surroundings. Jeremiah 17, verse 7, as was read for us earlier, blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord and whose trust is in the Lord, for he will be like a tree planted by the water that extends its roots by a stream and will not fear when the heat comes, but its leaves will be green, and it will not be anxious in a year of drought, nor cease to yield fruit. Our hope isn't compromised by heat or drought because our hope is like a constant source of water. It all comes down to something pretty important. God doesn't just give us hope, He is our hope. It's hard to always trust in that fact. I know it's not easy. I'm probably like maybe all of us that we're still working on it. We still want to find comfort in other things, something more tangible. But I think most of all, the difficult part of this, the difficult thing about real hope is it's going to require us to not be in charge. And that's where it gets tough. We want hope and we want to be in charge. But one cancels out the other. If there was ever a person, we're going to talk about one more person. And if there was ever a person who could have lost hope, someone who could have said, all these things are against me, or said, call me Mara, it would be Joseph. Sold into slavery by his own brothers. He was imprisoned for doing the right thing. There's a bunch of stuff that goes wrong in his life. And I can't find anything in Scripture that indicates he ever gave up hope. His perspective is very different from Jacob and Naomi, even though what we're about to read is spoken after everything turns out well. It's in Genesis 50. It reveals Joseph's attitude, I think, that he probably had all along. Regardless of the circumstances, he trusted in God. So here he is, he's talking to his brothers, the ones that sold him into slavery, who initially were going to kill him. Genesis 50, verse 20, they're terrified. They realize what they've done was wrong. But Genesis 50, verse 20 says so much about our God. This is Joseph talking to his brothers. He says, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. Saying there was a lot of bad stuff that was done, a lot of bad choices, a lot of bad decisions, so many bad things along the way. But it was in order to get to a great place, and that these bad things happened. God used them. But there's always hope because there was always God. I think that was the constant in Joseph's life. If you read the account of Joseph, you'll notice, and the Lord was with him. It might help us to focus on this one thing, that there's always hope because there's always God. God really does exist, and if you let him, he will be really involved. Romans 8:28. And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. But remember, it's a trade-off. And again, this is the sticky part. You can either have hope or you can be in charge. You can't have both. All of us have our ups and downs, and there's nothing worse than feeling hopeless. When things aren't going well, don't look at that little piece of your life and think, this is life. God is hope for a better life here and after here. The world's version of hope is a fragile thing, and it will let you down because it's not really based on anything. If you're a Christian, you have hope. If you're not a Christian, it would really be important to mention this morning before we're dismissed, God is the only one who can give you the hope you need, because God is your only hope. That's really the only kind that exists out there. So during this last song, you have the opportunity to turn things over to him, and we would be glad to help you with that. If you are a Christian, don't forget, if you let him, he will make things turn out great. You have to be patient, and you have to trust in him, and you wait, but it's going to be excellent. Whatever is weighing on you right now, or soon will be, whatever feels like a heavy shadow, you might be surprised how much peace of mind you can have if you turn things over to God. This life is leading to a greater life. With God, there's real hope. If you let him run things, everything is going to turn out just fine. If there's anything we can do to help you have real hope, you can pull someone aside before you leave and tell them, but you are also welcome to come forward as we stand together and sing.
There's a fountain free, 'tis for you and me. Let us haste, so haste to its brink. 'Tis the fount of love from the source above, and he bids us all freely drink. Will you come to the fountain free? Will you come? 'Tis for you and me, thirsty soul. Hear the welcome call. 'Tis a fountain open for all. There's a living stream with a crystal gleam. From the throne of life now it flows. While the waters roll, let the weary soul hear the call that forth freely goes. Will you come to the fountain free? Will you come? 'Tis for you and me, thirsty soul. Hear the welcome call. 'Tis a fountain open for all. There's a rock that's cleft, and no soul is left that may not its pure waters share. 'Tis for you and me, and its stream I see. Let us hasten joyfully there. Will you come to the fountain free? Will you come? 'Tis for you and me, thirsty soul. Hear the welcome call. 'Tis a fountain open for all. Please remain standing. We'll have our closing prayer.
We bow with me.